Distinguished guests, welcome to the DSET Dialogue with Professor Chris Miller. This event explores Taiwan's national security and the global semiconductor supply chain under Trump 2.0, aligning with DSET's research agendas. I'm your host today, Charlotte from DSET. We would like to welcome our distinguished guest, Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, National Security Council Senior Advisor Li Yujie, and also DSET Convener Professor and President Dr. Du Wenlin, and most important of all, Professor Miller. It's truly our pleasure to have you with us today. After the opening remarks by our distinguished guest and the group photo, the agenda will proceed with a brief introduction to DSET by CEO Dr. Jeremy Zhicheng, followed by a keynote speech by Professor Miller. The session will then conclude with the Q&A dialogue featuring 4 distinguished panelists and engagement with the audience. To begin, we're very honored to have Senior Advisor Dr. Li Yujie from the National Security Council to deliver the opening remarks. Let's welcome him.
Professor Chris Miller, now you know why TSMC is so successful. Taiwanese people work so late. Okay, distinguished guests, I'm glad to attend this event organized by DSET. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Chris Miller, who have traveled all the way from the United States to join us. He arrived this morning, 6 a.m., something like this. As we mark the second anniversary of the publication of Chip War, how has the direction of the U.S.-China technology competition changed? In a recent interview with Commonwealth magazine, Professor Chris Miller mentioned that the new round of U.S.-China technology competition is evolved from a chip war to a cloud war in the age of AI. I just mentioned to that the cyberspace, there is no boundary. So in the cloud, I believe that's a new battlefield. Okay. He knows that China is taking the different approach, prioritize efficiency over raw scale in developing its artificial intelligence industry. This assessment is remarkably accurate. The government of Taiwan is actively preparing for the new competition landscape. In February this year, President Lai convened a high-level national security meeting. He specifically emphasized that Taiwan will leverage its semiconductor technology advantage to transfer itself into an AI island and establish the global alliance for AI chip industry chain with partner nations, creating new opportunity for industrial development. Currently, we plan to release a National Security Strategy 2025 to ensure the cybersecurity resilience of Taiwan semiconductor and AI industry. In fact, I initiated this strategy. In this strategy, we have 4 pillars. The first pillar is the whole of society resilience. The second one is about the critical infrastructure. The third one is the supply chain security. The fourth is the emerging technology. I mean the AI applied to cybersecurity and cybersecurity of AI. I would like to express my sincerely gratitude to DSET for organizing this event. Over the past years, DSET has published substantial research in the field of semiconductors, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence, while continuously promoting dialogue and cooperations with our allies nations. I also thank all of the speakers present today and look forward to how today's discussion on artificial intelligence can further inform our national policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for sharing your encouragement remarks. Please stay as it's now time for a group photo. We would like to invite all the distinguished guests in the first row to join us now, professors, senior advisor, convener, and CEO, and all the panelists with us.那么麻烦也对我们镜头就是留下一个动态的影像，比如说打个招呼啊，或者是讲个说对。Thank you, everyone. Now we do another group photo with the audience. Can we have all the distinguished guests back to their seats, and we have another photo with our dear audience who attended this event for so late in this wonderful evening. 那么两侧的朋友也可以稍微靠近一点，如果想要入镜的话，这边的朋友，那边的朋友，好，那都坐着吧。那我们也要带一个动态的。好，那我们这一次请大家一起跟镜头挥个手，然后就是表示说我们在这么慎重的夜晚也盛装出席这样子的场合。还可以吗？哇，你现在好不好？谢谢大家。那 OK， 那我们最后在一个全景。因为这个场地呢比较宽一点，然后这是一个珍贵的时刻，谢谢大家的出席，我们一定要好好留下这样珍贵的纪念。Okay, thank you all very much for the special moment. Now let's welcome Dr. Jeremy Zhang Zhicheng, CEO of DSET, to share a short introduction of DSET and then moderate the dialogue with Professor Miller.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to this event. Although it's very late night, so I know everybody's already been very tired. But as Taiwanese, you know, we work 24/7. So it's very well. It's truly the great honor that, you know, to have Chris Miller, the best-selling book, the author of a best-selling book, Chip War, as well as professor of Tufts University, come to Taiwan at this critical moment for Taiwan-U.S. semiconductor collaboration. As an organizer of this event, I just want to take advantage of a little short bit of time to briefly introduce about DSET, because maybe some of our friends here first time join DSET's event. We are a research institute. We are a national think tank created in the end of 2023. Under Taiwan's National Science and Technology Council. We are currently focusing on the policy issue that related to technology and geopolitics. Currently, we diversify our research programs into two parts. We have an economic security research program, semiconductors, export control, investment screen, tariffs, and all the issues that related to the economic security. We are also conducting the research programs, democratic governance. The research program mostly focusing on the AI governance, disinformation, and cybersecurity issue. In terms of our national security research program, we are focusing on 3 issues: drone supply chain, communication resilience, mostly focusing on the satellites and submarine cables. And lastly, we also have a program called climate resilience and sustainability. So this program focuses on the climate change, energy security, and green tech. So these are all the research programs that we are currently focusing on. It's really our privilege to have Chris here, especially during the past 1 year and 4 months after we've been launched. We have a very frequent dialogue with Chris, both online and we met physically there in Washington, D.C. and Taipei as well, even in the first month that we've been created. So Chris visited us and gave us a lot of hints, information, and connections with policy leaders there in Washington, D.C. So it's a great honor to have Chris today. So we just want to give the floor to Chris to have your remarks for everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang. Please stay, as now we will invite all the panelists to come to the podium. Joining us are Mr. Chen Liangrong, Editor-at-Large at Commonwealth Magazine, Mr. Lin Hongda, Deputy Editor-in-Chief at Wealth Magazine, Ms. Zheng Tingfang, Shelf Technology Correspondent from Nikkei Asia, and Ms. Li Wenyi, Taiwan Technology Correspondent from Reuters, and the most important guest today, Professor Chris Miller, to have their seats. Now we will begin the anticipated speech from Professor Miller. Let us give him another applause.
Well, let me begin by extending a great deal of thanks to Jeremy and all of the organizers at DSET. As Jeremy mentioned, it's now been 2 years of collaboration between us, and I think there's no think tank in the world that in just 2 years has managed to have a real impact, not just in their home country on the issues that they focus on, but actually internationally on issues of semiconductor supply chains, export controls, tariffs, research security, and the like. I've learned a lot from their research, and so it's a real honor to continue this collaboration tonight. As Jeremy mentioned, this is a critical point for the United States and Taiwan when it comes to semiconductors, but also when it comes to the bilateral relationship in general, perhaps as critical of a point as we've had in the last half century, I think, in U.S.-Taiwan relations. And so what I'd like to do in my opening remarks is to both touch on semiconductor-specific aspects of that relationship, but also to place them in, I think, the necessary context of the overall bilateral relationship and the overall political and security architecture in Asia and indeed around the world, which I think to a substantial degree is in a state of flux that we have not seen in decades. When it comes to semiconductor-specific issues, there are a number of specific topics that are on the agenda right now in U.S.-Taiwan bilateral relations. There's the question of tariffs, which of course President Trump has embraced as a policy tool in a way that we haven't seen the leader of a major economy embrace in several decades. He's promised to impose tariffs on major trading partners of the United States, which are the world's other largest economies, Europe, China, chief among them. And I think this presages substantial shifts in the structure of international supply chains in general, and therefore shifts for the semiconductor industry. Now, of course, it was the case that President Trump imposed substantial tariffs on China in his first term, but we've already in the first 2 months of his second term seen the average tariff rate on China double. And it's doubled at a time when he's been imposing tariffs on other countries, and so we've barely even noticed the fact that tariffs on China are now twice as high as they were when he took office just 2 months ago. And I think that's a good data point for the scale of shifts that we should expect to see over the subsequent 3 years and 10 months that remain in President Trump's term in office. And that has vast implications for many countries, but especially for a trade-dependent country like Taiwan. And even if it's the case that President Trump decides not to impose tariffs on Taiwan in particular, and I have no crystal ball that lets me predict what he will do or won't do when it comes to tariffs, any major shift in the world trading regime is bound to have very important implications for a country like Taiwan that is highly trade dependent and deeply integrated into U.S. Supply chains. So I think tariffs are going to be one key issue in the bilateral relationship that we can discuss this evening. I think a second key issue is going to be the ongoing technology competition between the United States and China, which has several different aspects to it. Export controls on advanced semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, regulations in terms of accessing cloud computing services by both Chinese and other countries, access to US cloud providers, access to R&D capabilities and know-how, which the Trump administration has also targeted as a policy aim, trying to restrict the transfer of expertise and knowledge to China. All of these are areas where, in theory, there's a lot of alignment with Taiwan's government, but I think in practice there's also a fair amount of scope for friction as Taiwanese companies, as well as companies from other countries, interact with the controls that already exist and new controls, which I think are likely to be put in place. And so the escalation of technology competition is going to have an additional impact on technology supply chains and therefore an impact on the structure of the U.S.-Taiwan economic relationship. I think a third challenge is going to be when it comes to security, because of course it's impossible to look at the U.S.-Taiwan economic relationship solely through the lens of trade or technology. Since the founding of modern Taiwan and since the origins of modern U.S.-Taiwan relations, there's been a deep, if complex, security relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan. And I think I'm not going on a limb to suggest that that security relationship is at a point of tension and stress right now in a way that it really hasn't been since perhaps the 1970s, a half a century ago, when we saw a major change in the nature of U.S.-Taiwan relations. We've seen President Trump over the past 2 months be very forthright in his desire that other countries that are partners or allies of the United States spend more on defense. And we've seen the Trump administration be, I think, aggressive in its pressure tactics to get other countries, especially in Europe, thus far, to spend more on defense. But I don't think we should expect the Trump administration to stop at Europe. And indeed, I think when the Trump administration looks at the change in European defense policy over the past 2 months, they believe their tactics are working. Germany's passed an almost €1 trillion of additional spending on infrastructure and defense, just to give one data point. And with results like that, I think we should expect the Trump administration to continue using similar tactics to pressure other allies and other partners to spend more on their defense too. And so I think that has implications for Japan, I think it has implications for Korea, it could have implications for Australia, but I think Taiwan also has substantial implications for. And it would be, I think, wrong to assume the discussion about the defense relationship can be separated or will be separated from the discussion about trade. When it comes to U.S.-European relations, we've seen the Trump administration intermingle economic and political and security discussions. They're not separate tracks, they're all combined. And I think we should assume a similar conversation starts up in earnest at some point between the Trump administration and Taiwan, that intermingles security, intermingles trade, intermingles technology and broader economic concerns. And I think that's going to be a hard conversation to be had. I think President Trump has illustrated that he is keenly focused on questions of power and leverage. I think the most insightful aspect of his conversation with Ukrainian President Zelensky from several weeks ago was when he told President Zelensky, "You don't have the cards," which I think was for many people shocking because they'd come to expect U.S.-Ukraine relations to be discussed through concepts of shared values or shared interests, and President Trump was much more transactional, focused on power imbalances and keen to use what he perceived as a power imbalance in his interests. And I think we've seen President Trump pursue similar tactics with regard to other countries that are smaller in the United States. And so when I think about the future of U.S.-Taiwan bilateral relations over the next couple of months or the next 4 years, I think we should expect some pretty hard-elbowed diplomacy from the United States. And I think it'll be a real challenge for the U.S. and Taiwan to manage both the domestic politics in the United States and I think whatever the domestic political impact is in Taiwan when those conversations begin in earnest. And semiconductors will be part of that conversation because they'll be inseparable from security. When I talk to my friends in the chip industry, most of them wish they could get in a time machine and go back to 2015, which was when a time they didn't have to think about politics. They didn't have to get photographed next to presidents. They didn't have to analyze their supply chains to see which countries they intersected with. But I'm afraid we're not going back to that world anytime soon. If anything, the chip industry intersects even more with politics today than it did when I started researching chip war. For better or for worse, that's the world we live in. And as I think we stand at the cusp of another major change in the international trading system, another major change in the structure of supply chains, I think the politicization of the chip industry is going to ratchet up one level higher, with implications for US, for Taiwan, for China, for Japan, for all the other countries that have a big role in the chip industry. And for the United States and Taiwan, which I think share a whole lot of interests in both the chip industry and more broadly, managing this new level of politicization is going to be a real challenge, which is why I'm excited to be back in Taipei to learn about how Taiwanese government and society and industry are thinking about these challenges, and I appreciate all the work that DSET is doing in engaging in these complicated discussions. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for the insightful sharing. In the upcoming session, DSET look forward to the engaging evening ahead. For the panelists, please be reminded that each panelist could be 2 minutes limited to your discussion in each round. So let's welcome Dr. Jeremy Zhicheng as a moderator and the panelists to discuss with Professor Miller. Let's give them a warm applause.
Chris, so thank you, Chris, for the impressive remarks. You mentioned many points, which is very critical, and I think there is a huge anxiety shared among not only all the other like-minded countries, but also especially here on this island nation, this is the tech community here. So we we released this report in President Trump's inauguration day. We titled it "Walking a Tightrope." Navigating Taiwan-U.S. semiconductor security under Trump 2.0. Some of the points you mentioned, we also covered about this. And also because during we are creating this report, we interview Chris many times, and you give us a lot of hints and information and thought in terms of how do we navigate the future of this uncertain era. And so because we are really looking forward to fruitful discussions, so today we are inviting 4 leaders, intelligent leaders from the media, who are the senior journalists, covers tech issues and industry for many years. So they are representing Taiwanese people who are working and living in this community, and to have a discussion with you. So firstly, we are going to have Liang Rong. Liang Rong is the editor-at-large in Commonwealth magazine. And also, I'm a super big fan of Liang Rong's podcast episode. And you have recorded an episode, I think, a couple of weeks ago with Chris. So yeah, I just want to pass the microphone to Liang Rong.
Thank you for your introduction. And Chris, your lecture set a very good stage for my following up questions. Since I have to ask questions for the normal people in Taiwan, so I have to ask easier questions. In these days, when we see an American, the first thing we will ask is, what's wrong with your president? So, you know what I'm going to ask. But it's strange for Taiwanese because during Trump 1.0, we admire Trump. Without Trump 1.0, all the AI servers will not manufacture in Taiwan. Maybe a lot of them will be manufactured in China. And I have talked with the supply chain people of the servers these days. Most of them, they say their largest competitor is Chinese. And without Trump, they will lose. And thanks for Trump, they now have all the orders from NVIDIA. So somebody even talk about building a temple for Trump. That's before last year. But right now, things totally different. Like we have talked before in my podcast, when at the beginning of the Trump 2.0, I asked you, Donald Trump say that Taiwan stole the chip industry from the US. What should we do? He's now a president. Do we need to give him back the chip industry? And you told me that don't worry. That's only something he's talking during the campaign. Everything will be normal like Trump 1.0. But, that's different. So can you give us some insight about what really happened? Why everybody predict wrong? And if the trend continues, what the Taiwan semiconductor industry or the tech industry will be like in maybe 2030? That's my first question. You want to answer it right now, or?
Tim Fang's question as well.
Okay.
And Chris, you
respond. Okay.
Thanks so much, Liang for expressing the anxiety for the Taiwanese people here. And also, and the next panelist is郑婷方, who's the chief technology correspondent from Nikkei Asia. And I also watched many times of your dialogue online with both, including Chris and Tim Fang. So Tim Fang is another representative for Taiwan.
After Liang Dage asked you a question about Trump 2.0, I think the whole supply chain is also very worried about the new chip war between US and China, because all of that could affect the broader supply chain around the world, especially also in Asia, in Taiwan, in Japan, in South Korea. So one thing I especially hope to ask you is, after China's initial success in EV, they now identify humanoid robots as their next major area for development, and then already attract a lot of Chinese investment to that area. And then a lot of Chinese companies, including like Xiaomi, Xiaopeng, a lot of them already say they are developing humanoid robots. And then also we heard that China have an upper hand because they produce a lot of precision components for humanoid robots. And then so that could be they have the upper hand. So what we want to ask is, how do you foresee the next phase of US-China technology rivalry unfolding, and what's at stake? And some people say that humanoid robots do not require cutting-edge chips. So how concerned should we be about the potential disruption, given the China's growing capability in mature chips and DRAMs? How concerned should Taiwan or the US be? And then whether we are welcoming this new mature chip shock from China. And then second question that everyone hope to ask Chris is also about China's localization campaign. For example, they hope to build all the supply chain by themselves. For example, Huawei want to build from chip production to chip equipment, and we see a lot of progress. They are announcing they can build a lithography machine or something. And in your chip war book, you talk about the lithography history. So we hope to ask you whether you think China could build their own lithography machine and other machines, and whether that will disrupt the global semiconductor industry, whether like Applied Materials, Tokyo Electron, the whole industry need to worry about that. Thank you.
Okay, so because we have collected the questions from Liang and Ting Fang, I think Liang mostly focusing on the Trump issue and Ting Fang focusing on the China issue. So we have 10 minutes for you, Chris, to respond firstly for both of them, their questions. Okay.
Thank you. So on understanding the Trump administration's policies and changes in continuities, I think it's easy in the media environment we live in to focus solely on changes. So let me start by focusing on continuities first, and then I'll talk about changes. On continuities, TSMC announced its first investment in Arizona under the first Trump administration. That is a continuity. Now, the scale of investment has increased, the number of fabs planned to be built has grown over time, but it was now 6 years ago when TSMC first announced its investment. And so that is a continuity that's existed now across 3 different US administrations, across 2 different leadership teams at TSMC, across a whole lot of change in the chip industry, across the invention of ChatGPT. A lot has changed, and yet that has remained constant. So there's a continuity, and I think if you watch the press conference between President Trump and CC Wei several weeks ago, people were surprised by the $100 billion number, but I don't think anyone was surprised to see the US president and the TSMC CEO because we've gotten used to that type of event. So there's a major continuity. On tariffs, when it comes to semiconductor tariffs, President Trump imposed tariffs on the import of semiconductors from China in his first term. President Biden doubled the rate of tariffs on semiconductors from China. So there's another continuity. Now they're even higher in Trump's third term. So that's a continuity. When it comes to export controls, we haven't yet seen any new export control moves from the Trump administration, but there was a whole lot of continuity, I would argue, from the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and I think the next move on export controls will be to make them more restrictive, not less restrictive. So I think there'll be continuity on that issue as well. And so I think it is important for us as we look at the contours of US policy to not overly index on the drama of today's headline. There will always be dramatic headlines, but also to take the continuity seriously. And I think we need to focus on the continuities as well as the changes, because the continuities help us understand what's actually driving policy. It's easy to over-index on any given president, but when you've got continuity of policy across 3 different presidencies with different cabinet secretaries, different political parties in the White House, different political parties in Congress, it shows you that there are broader forces in US politics, in US business that are driving some of these shifts. And so I think those forces persist even as the presidents change. So then what's changed? I think first off, many of us, myself I think included, in the time that Trump was not president, when Biden was president, I think forgot the extent to which President Trump has a unique skill in dominating the media environment. In his first term, every headline was about Trump. Trump doing good things, Trump doing bad things, Trump doing great, Trump being terrible, it was all about Trump. And it's not only the United States, every country I go to, it's as if they have no domestic politics and all they want to talk about is Trump too. We forgot about that when Biden was president because Biden wasn't very good at dominating the media environment. And now that Trump's back, we're surprised at just the extent of headlines being about Trump. And so I think part of what we're reacting to now is that every headline we see is about Trump, and therefore we're all talking and focusing and fixating on Trump. I think the second thing that's changed is that President Trump does not have to run for re-election. And it's often said to be the case in US politics that in their second terms, presidents focus on their legacies. They're less constrained by the day-to-day of politics, and they're thinking more about what do they want to accomplish before their term ends. And I think President Trump has been pretty clear that tariffs and a restructuring of the international trading system are a priority. And so I think that does suggest an increased willingness to take economic risks on the tariff front, to watch the stock market decline, to have companies be frustrated with him, which is why we've seen tariffs on Canada, which I think very few people would have expected just a couple of months ago. That said, I think we've also seen the Trump administration already, just 2 months in, be responsive to the economic impact of tariffs. When auto company CEOs call and say, your tariffs on Canada are going to drive up car prices, we've seen the Trump administration step back. It appears to be the case that the decline in the stock market has already begun impacting decision-making in the White House. And so exactly how will that process work is impossible to predict with certainty. But I would suggest that we need to focus on the factors that are shaping the White House's decision-making as much as we focus on the tweet of the day. Because I think if you look back to the first Trump term and ask, were you better off focusing on the tweet of the day, or were you better off trying to understand the structure of politics? The structure of politics was a much better guide to what mattered in the medium and long run than the tweet or the headline of the day. And so that I think is my takeaway from the first 2 months of the Trump administration, which doesn't mean that we can predict exactly what will happen next week or the week after. But I think structure does matter in addition to the agency of any individual president. I think turning to Annie's question, I think the president that we've all, please. Yeah.
Finish talking. Since there's a continuity of 2030, if the continuity persists.
Yeah. So I think since the first Trump administration, the strength of Taiwan's chip industry has grown. TSMC's market share is higher today than it was when Trump left office. It's higher than when Trump first took office. And so sometimes when I come to Taipei, I hear people tell me about the hollowing out of the Taiwanese chip industry, and I ask them, what chip industry are they looking at? Because the rest of the world looks at Taiwan and says Taiwan's position is stronger than ever. And so I don't see a reason to think that those trends will dramatically change, because the reason Taiwan's chip industry is so central in the world's tech supply chains is not because of any sort of political factor. It's because of technology leadership that other companies can't match. And so unless that dynamic changes, it seems to me that Taiwan's position when it comes to semiconductors will remain very strong like it is today. I think the open question is when it comes to the rest of the AI supply chain, everything above AI hardware, what role will Taiwan play there? I think there's great opportunities, but there's also no guarantee that Taiwanese firms will manage to monetize above the chip level. And I think we should expect that a lot of the big businesses that will be built, a lot of the economic profits will accrue not only to the chip level, but also to all the software that's built on top. And that's where I'm not sure to what extent Taiwan will be a big player there or not. When it comes to Annie's question, I think the president that we've not thought enough about over the past 2 months is President Xi, who, of course, is a major player, perhaps the major player in the trends that we're seeing. I think people often believe that President Trump started the chip war. And I can assure you that there was almost no one in Washington who could pronounce the word semiconductor, to say nothing of extreme ultraviolet photolithography in 2016 when President Trump was first elected. The reason semiconductors emerged on the radar screen of US policymakers was because of concern about China's efforts to build up its own indigenous capabilities. And I think, and I argued this in Chip War, that there was a learning process whereby first, it was industry and government in Taiwan that was watching what was happening in China and registering concern. Then it was Japan that began to look at what was happening, getting concerned. And only after that was it the case that policymakers in Washington came to focus on semiconductors. I even interviewed one member of the national security staff in the first Trump administration and asked, when did you start focusing on photolithography as an important topic? And he told me, oh, when my Japanese counterpart told me I should look into it. And so I think if you want to understand how the United States got involved in the chip war, it was by learning from partners who were following more closely than Washington was. And I think this speaks to one of the key drivers of the chip war, which is that China's efforts to build its own indigenous supply chain are, I think, stronger than ever. The amount of resources China is putting into these efforts are as large as they've ever been. And the fact that China's made steady progress in many different segments of the supply chain over the last decade mean that its capabilities are, again, greater than they've ever been. And we see this impacting companies in Taiwan, in the United States, in Japan, in Europe, perhaps above all in Korea, which is facing China head-on in the memory market, for example. I think President Xi, for a variety of reasons, my conclusion at least is that he believes that self-sufficiency in chips is a core economic and national security goal. And as a result, China is willing to spend vast resources with the aim of building self-sufficiency. And I don't really believe that policy shifts in other countries are going to dramatically change this dynamic. I think China's policy is broadly speaking set in its direction. China succeeded in building a whole lot of indigenous capacity when it comes to both manufacturing excuse me, and design. And I think China's made some progress in beginning to replicate the tools that are needed in semiconductor manufacturing. I think there's still a long way to go. We've seen headlines about Chinese photolithography tools. I think thus far those are only headlines. Thank you. But I think we should expect a country as large and sophisticated as China to eventually be able to indigenize more and more, which means that any sort of technology controls will be temporary rather than permanent in their efficacy.
How long do you think they can do it, especially in lithography? That's very difficult. How long do you think they can do it, especially like in lithography, which is extremely challenging?
Well, this is the key question. Nobody knows exactly how long. It's almost impossible to predict. I mean, we know that there have been public reports of numerous ASML staff being hired by a variety of Chinese firms. We see media reports saying that Chinese researchers have unlimited salaries to work on photolithography. One assumes that the Chinese government has been very helpful in hacking into designs of various tools and the components that are needed. But we also know that it took 3 decades of research to build the first EUV tool that worked in a commercially viable manner. And we know that every generation of lithography tool gets better and better, higher throughput, better yield, et cetera. And so in lithography, like in every other segment of the supply chain, you're not trying to catch up to a static technology. You're trying to catch up to a technology that's rapidly moving forward. It's already been 6 years since China's been trying and been unable to acquire ASML EUV tools. 6 years is a long time to be trying to acquire a tool and not being able to access it. My best guess was that it would take a decade to indigenize lithography tools, which if it's true, China would have its own EUV tool in 4 years. But now I think that it might take longer than a decade because 4 years seems pretty soon, given that right now China doesn't have its own competitive DUV tool. And I think you probably need a DUV tool before you can make an EUV tool. So it may be even longer than a decade to fully indigenize.
Yeah, thank you so much for Chris' response to both Liang Dong and Tim Fang's question. I think this is super critical for us to keeping watching the trend there in Washington D.C. Although there is a continuity you've mentioned there in Trump administration. On the other hand, there is a huge anxiety as well that we see the former friends there in the Trump 1.0. Doesn't be nominated again there in the Trump 2.0. Well, Matt Pottinger, who were visiting us here last month, Mike Pompeo. So those were, traditionally the friends of Taiwan. But we see more uncertainty when Elon Musk or also our leaders, they're not traditional policymakers, but they are getting more and more influential. On the other hand, as you mentioned, because we are in the hub of manufacturing activities here in this region, so people has traditionally more informations on the tech issues, especially on the competition side. We always the stakeholders here always firstly capable of addressing the issues or the alarms when the China is accessing or surpassing our capacity of sort of technologies. So that's why we are trying to do the OC methodology work and publish more and more reports on this part because we want to bring the agenda to Washington, D.C., make sure that everybody on the same page because we are in the center of manufacturing activities. And there is not many people there in Washington, D.C. are capable of accessing to this critical information. So the second round, we're going to have Hongda and Wenyi. So Hongda is the chief technology correspondent. Hongda. All right. Oh, deputy editor-in-chief in Wealthy magazine. Hongda is also a veteran journalist for semiconductor industry. Recently, Hongda is co-authoring a report with DSET, especially focusing on the legacy chip. So I might want to pass the microphone to Hongda for your question or for your thought with Chris.
Hi, Chris. I hope to discuss questions we are looking for answers for a long time about the mature node. Because when it comes to capacity, Taiwan holds the #1 in the mature node capacity. And when you want to build an AI server, you want to build a car, or you want a toy, you need that. Without a mature node IC, you cannot build an AI server. That's important for Taiwan's economy security too, because many of the companies, their products are in mature node, even include TSMC. But what we already saw that is China invests a lot in mature node capacity, and they try to every single process they want to do what they can to produce by themselves. So now what happens is, but we see that according to the SIA, United States not invested that much in mature node. By 2032, I see the United States will have only 10% of the market share when it comes to mature nodes. So my question is, if the chip shortage comes back again, how United States can achieve the supply chain security, and what kind of policies United States will use to enhance the mature nodes security. And because Taiwan has a very significant capacity, how Taiwan and United States can cooperate with each other to enhance such supply chain resilience? Yeah, that's my question.
The second round, the second panelist is Li Wenyi from Reuters. Wenyi has, previously just changed your position to Reuters, Taiwan technology correspondent. So Wenyi, it's your turn to have your thoughts and questions.
Thank you so much. Just following up on Hongda's question, because he's more focused on the mature node chips, but also wanted to, what I wanted to say is that actually TSMC's advanced nodes is still having a lot of high market share. So, and that is why at the White House, President Trump also called TSMC a monopoly. So my question is that, do you think TSMC's $100 billion investment is going to, is enough to ease the pressure from being called as a monopoly and keep it from being targeted by the US government? That's my first question. And my second question is also still focused on TSMC even with all of the money that TSMC is going to invest in the United States, we're still seeing that the tariff still is still an issue, as Trump still hasn't. It looks like Taiwan isn't spared from the Trump's talk of tariffs. So I was just wondering, do you think more investment from Taiwanese companies in the U.S. could actually help Taiwan and make a difference, or if there's anything that you think Taiwan government could have done better to negotiate? Thank you.
On legacy chips, and when TSMC and other Taiwanese companies, they're in the U.S. Okay, so these are two questions from our panelists. So, Chris, please.
Thank you. So on the question of legacy chips, I think there's been a recognition in the US, in Taiwan, in Japan, to some degree in Europe, depending on which European country you're talking about, that there is already major impacts in the pricing from China's expansion of legacy chip production, and that there are risks to overdependence on Chinese components and supply chains. However, the question of what to do about that is a real challenge. We've already seen a number of instances, very well documented, of Western companies declining to invest more in legacy chip production because they were afraid if they did invest more, they wouldn't make any money given Chinese pricing. That's exactly the opposite dynamic of what we'd like to see. We'd like to see more investment in friendly countries so we weren't as reliant on China, but we're seeing the opposite. So what can be done? Well, there's a couple of policies that have been discussed, none of which have been really acted upon at scale. We've seen the US impose tariffs on the import of chips from China. The problem is that the US doesn't really import that many chips directly from China. And the complexity of supply chains means that if you wanted to use tariffs as a tool, you'd have to impose tariffs at the component level. And that's administratively very, very challenging. There are a couple of precedents in US trade history where the US has imposed component level tariffs, but they're pretty obscure precedents, and they were targeting products that were much less widespread than semiconductors. And most manufacturers say it would be costly or maybe even impossible in the short run to ascertain what are all the chips in their bill of materials and then to tell the customs agency about this and apply a proper tariffs. There are real, please. No, I think certainly companies have an incentive to play up the difficulty, but I think they're right to say that the interface with the customs would be a real challenge. In the US, we've had a sort of a dry run experiment with the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which bans the use of any products that are tied to Xinjiang. And companies have found that it's been a real challenge to comply with that. And a number of companies, Volkswagen, for example, had a large volume of cars that were tied up at the border because they couldn't certify that they didn't have Xinjiang components in them. I think that experience has given a lot of companies some of the tools they need to begin deploying component level tariffs. But I think it is the case that given that we've never done this at scale before, applying component tariffs to a component that is in every product, and often in every product by the dozens or hundreds or thousands, would be a logistical challenge. My view is that it's still worth exploring, but if we're going to explore it, we should have a long time horizon for when we begin to implement any sort of component tariffs. And so I think if you were to say, if you impose component tariffs tomorrow, would it be disruptive? Absolutely. If you impose component tariffs starting in 2030, would it be disruptive? Well, no, you'd have time to adjust. And so it'll be interesting to watch how the component tariff debate evolves. It's a powerful tool, but a potentially disruptive tool. I think the second tool we've seen that's been used in limited cases thus far is simply banning Chinese chips from certain sensitive supply chains. We've seen this in connected cars, for example, in the US. We're going to see it soon in drone supply chains, perhaps in certain data center applications. But thus far, it's been limited to spheres where data security is seen to be important, or there's a risk of sabotage that has national security implications, not for broad civilian applications. And we've also seen no movement along this front in Europe, and very little on this in Japan. And I think it's worth recognizing that the US is only 20% of the world economy, and so if the US acts alone, this type of effort, it risks not having the scale needed to have a global level success. If you have the entire G7 acting together, you have more than half of global GDP acting together, you have scale on your side. But if the US acts alone, scale is on the side of everyone else who doesn't act. And so assembling a coalition around this is very tricky, especially given the difficulty of working with the Europeans. And so this is a second tactic, banning Chinese components, that has limits of its efficacy unless you can build a coalition. A third tactic is trying to subsidize. And the US is subsidized, Japan subsidized, Europe subsidized, but I think the unfortunate news is that no one is going to win a subsidy race against China. And so subsidies are at best a limited tool for short-run application. And all this means that we've got a variety of tools, none of which are perfect, none of which have been tried at scale, which is why China continues to win market share in legacy chips, and Western firms invest less than they otherwise would. I think it is a real problem. I think there's a need for action, but I don't yet see a coalition formed between enough countries to provide a real path to a credible response. Please. Yes.
TR have the 301 investigations about China. So what will have the impact to the semiconductor trade in the future? What's the possibilities out there?
Well, we don't know what the results of that investigation will be. I'm sure the investigation will find subsidies in China. I'm not sure what remedies it will recommend. They could recommend even higher tariffs on chips coming in from China, but that won't matter for the reasons we discussed. They could recommend component tariffs. They could recommend quotas, which again doesn't seem to me to be likely to have the effect that we're looking at. I think the key question is, could you imagine a scenario in which the Trump administration uses tariff pressure on the Europeans and then gets the Europeans to, in turn, cooperate? And I think the track record is that that's very hard to do, both because the Trump administration's relations with Europe right now are bad, and the European Union is one of the hardest organizations to get to do anything. So I think, I know that TSMC's announcement of its new investments in Arizona have been much debated in Taiwan. I think from the perspective of someone watching the press conference between C.C. Wei and President Trump in the United States, I will say that it came off as an extraordinary success. I think TSMC managed to put itself in a position of partnership with the new administration. President Trump was very supportive of TSMC in his remarks, praised the company, praised its technology, praised its centrality to U.S. AI supply chains. And I think all of those are wins for TSMC. I think they're wins for the U.S.-Taiwan relationship as well. And so I do hope that the announcement does help to stabilize both TSMC's relationship with the U.S. government and bilateral ties. But I don't think it obviates the need for action on all the other issues in the relationship that the Trump administration is going to push for. And so I think the Trump administration has signaled that as part of the reciprocal tariff discussion that the president wants. There will be discussion of tariff rates, of corporate tax differentials, of non-tariff barriers to trade. And I think we should expect all of those issues to be brought up in the bilateral U.S.-Taiwan relationship as well. So I don't think the TSMC announcement solves every issue, but I think it does put the relationship on a much stronger foot than it might have been. And in that sense, I think it was a success. I think you also asked the question about President Trump referring to TSMC as a monopoly, not once but twice, if I recall correctly, in the press conference. I think this gets back to our discussion about the strength of Taiwan's semiconductor industry. No tech CEO likes to hear their company described as a monopoly, but there are many tech CEOs who wish that their companies could be plausibly described as a monopoly, but have not yet achieved enough market share to reach that goal. I think if you look historically, every technology company with such a level of market share has faced some degree of competition regulation or antitrust discussion from the U.S. government, whether it's AT&T and the U.S. telecoms network, or IBM and mainframe computers, or Microsoft and the personal computer or Apple or Google, they've all faced some degree of investigations or of regulation. And I think it's no surprise that now that TSMC is in the ranks of the world's great tech companies, it also faces these types of questions. What does that mean specifically? I think it's hard to predict exactly how this discussion will play out, but I don't think we should be surprised to see a tech company with a $800 billion market capitalization and 90% market share having to answer questions about competition policy. I think that's inevitable when you're so successful.
Yeah. In terms of legacy chips, so I just mentioned to Chris, we are going to release our new list report, which we call Off the Wave Honda. We are going to propose a comprehensive strategy on the Chinese legacy chips. So we're bringing this idea to Washington, D.C. the next week as well. On the other hand, so in terms of Winnie's question on TSMC going to the U.S., I think all of us believe that it's only the phase one for the Taiwanese manufacturers going to the U.S. And we don't know what's so. My following question will be, how do you predict the end goal for the U.S.? You previously mentioned about that this is necessary for the U.S. to gain the capacity of TSMC or other most advanced semiconductor manufacturing capacity, the R&D there in the U.S. as well. But what's your take for the end goal as a U.S. strategist for the future of the dominating technology on semiconductor manufacturing?
Any world leader, would you like your country to dominate advanced semiconductor manufacturing? They would say yes. And so I don't think we should be surprised to see U.S. political leaders articulate similar goals of having a bigger role in advanced chip making, of having cutting edge R&D. But that's not really a useful signal as to what the policy actually is. And so I think the key question is going to be, to what extent does the U.S. government provide incentives or use leverage to attract or to push more investment in the United States? And I think here there are costs and benefits to the U.S., just like there are costs and benefits to companies. I think the benefits to political leaders are that if you want more manufacturing investment, if you think this is within your political interest and you get more manufacturing investment, then you can celebrate that in front of your voters. You can say you've delivered on your promises. I think the costs are that if it's the case that you're attracting investment in ways that increase cost structures, and so downstream consumers pay more, well, those are costs that will filter through your economy over time. And I think for the United States, there's a challenging set of trade-offs, in particular around advanced chip making and AI. I think the Trump administration has said it wants AI dominance as its strategy for artificial intelligence. It wants as many AI models trained and then deployed in the US as it can get. And there's a pretty direct trade-off between your ability to capitalize on AI and the cost of your AI hardware. If your AI hardware costs twice as much, you're going to have a lot less of it. And so I think as the administration in aggregate thinks about how much chip making does it want in the US versus in other countries, part of the equation is, well, what's the cost differential? And I think it's pretty clear there will be a cost differential. We can debate how large it will be. And so I think next to the slogans of political leaders, or next to statements like we would obviously like more chip manufacturing, the question is, well, at what cost to the budget, at what cost to your industries, at what cost to economic growth? And here I think there's a recognition of real trade-offs. I think it's notable that a month ago it was possible to hear discussions about imposing tariffs on imports of advanced semiconductors in the United States. And at least this month that has died down, in part because I think of a realization that who would pay the costs of tariffs on importing high-end chips? It would be the US AI industry. It would be the largest payer of those tariffs. And so I think those trade-offs are real. They don't often translate directly into political rhetoric under the current president, or I think under many presidents. That doesn't mean they don't exist. And so I think that's a key part of understanding the U.S. policy calculus.
Thank you all for your valuable comments. Let's give them a round of applause again. Now we will open the floor to the audience. Please raise your hand and identify yourself, including your name and affiliation, and keep the questions short for Professor Miller as the main responder. Questions for the panelists are also welcomed as well. We may collect 3 questions choose by Director Zhang in the first round. Thank you.
So I'm picking each of the section for 1 question. So first one, I'm picking 3. Dr. Lai. Yeah.
Please remember to use your microphone on your table.
All right, thank you for giving me a microphone. Yicheng Lai from the Prospect Foundations. So good to see you again, Chris. The issue is that I'd just like to ask about what should we expect the technology conversation in the Trump administrations? Because we do see that during the Biden administration, it seems that the technology that talks from the standpoint of economic security, so that we have the Chip and Science Act, and also the kind of small yard high fences policies. But Trump seems to be in a very different world and in acting both as industrial capacity building, so that they wanted to have a whole full American-made supply chain, as well as the jobs creation policies. But add to the mix is that about the possible officials managing the Trump administration's technology policy, we do notice that people like Jack Halbert, that's soon to go over either in the State Department or the Commerce Department on the Bureau of Industrial Securities, as well as and also the David Sachs in the National Technology Council in the White House. They are basically all software backgrounds. That is, they work on AI. None of them, they are manufacturers, and they are also basically pay part gain. That's very different from the in the Biden administration, where some people, they have the manufacturing experience that taking over in terms of tech policies. So that with those different backgrounds of those people in the soon to take over in the administrations, as well currently that you see about the administration's various measures, what you think that the conversation will be different? So yeah.
Picking another question. Nobody here? Okay. The gentleman in the first, yeah.
Hi, I'm Guillermo Ailery. I am G-Man. I work at INDSR. I have a very quick question. Given the fact that China has been able to develop its technology over, let's say, the last 25 years at a very rapid rate, can you discuss let's say, a boundary of 2 different technologies where people thought they couldn't do it and they did, and another technology that they wanted to do but couldn't do? And can you bound that in the context of semiconductors? Thank you.
Question would be gentleman, Jeremy Chan. Yeah. So you're.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Zhang, Executive Yuan. Actually, building on Dr. Lai's question, I was also really interested because when we look at the U.S.'s chip policy, it should not be viewed in isolation, but in relation to other Trump administration priorities. And also, we do see in Trump 2.0, there seems to be a more centralized decision-making structure, centralized meaning maybe down to the president himself. So what we see is, at best, maybe Trump's inattentive attention or attentive inattention towards chips. So he talks about chips, for example, as a monopoly, but in contrast with his first administration or Biden's administration, there was a more technological focus on it. How does his dynamic with his team, and for example, some describe his relation with his team as more hierarchical. How does his relation with his team and also his other policy priorities affect his approach towards chips? Would it be a more contractual approach, as for example we see in his first administration, at one point ZTE was in the crosshairs, the other second it wasn't. Thank you.
So Chris, can you just quickly respond to both of all of the questions? I think for related to Trump administration and on the side, technology.
Yep. So on the questions about interpreting the Trump administration, I think every U.S. president will say that their goal is to create jobs, whatever they're doing. And so I think we can generally ignore political leaders when they're talking about creating jobs because it means almost nothing. And that's not a statement about President Trump. President Biden would go to advanced manufacturing facilities that were entirely full of robots and talk about creating jobs as well. So I would ignore job creation as a meaningful statement. I think you're right, though, to suggest that rebuilding industrial capacity has been a topic of discussion in Washington. I would note that manufacturing as a share of U.S. GDP has not changed meaningfully in the now decade in which there's been more and more discussion in the United States about rebuilding manufacturing capacity. And I think if you look at the spheres where there's actual action in rebuilding manufacturing capacity, it's very narrowly focused on defense-related manufacturing. And there's a reason for that. It would be very expensive to have a broader reindustrialization of the United States. And although that it sounds good as a political phrase, I think once one begins to think through the economic implications of what would be necessary to meaningfully increase manufacturing as a share of GDP, it's not at all clear to me that the American body politic is willing to pay the costs of that type of effort. So my guess would be that in 4 years' time, we see manufacturing as a share of GDP roughly comparable to what it is today, because to shift it would require major economic shifts. And so I would focus in particular on where there's actual action taking on reindustrialization or manufacturing, and there it's again in these narrow spheres: drones, shipbuilding, defense industrial relevant spheres. On the question of China and catching up, I think there's a long history of people saying China can copy, but it can't innovate. I think that is all very clearly wrong. However, there are spheres where China still imports from the outside world. And I think it's insightful to look at the goods that China imports as net imports of manufactured goods. What you find is that there are very few products in which China is a net importer when it comes to manufactured goods. China mostly imports commodities: oil, natural gas, ag commodities. Semiconductors are top of the list by far. Semiconductor manufacturing equipment is the second largest category of manufactured goods that China imports. And there are small volumes, a couple of other things: jet engines, certain types of advanced machine tools, certain types of advanced biotechnology equipment. And I think what links together all of these manufactured goods that China still imports, and which therefore China can't produce domestically at the quality that it needs, is that there's a high number of components and a very, very low margin of error in all of these. And so this is the type of manufacturing that's the hardest to do. It's therefore the highest margin. And it's where China is naturally focusing its efforts, both for reasons of self-sufficiency and for economics. And I think that's what unites all of these different areas, which doesn't mean that they're going to be impossible to replicate. It just means it takes much longer than other spheres of manufacturing, which have fewer components and larger tolerances for error.
So for the second round of the question, again, I'm picking sections from here. The lady. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. That helps. You were talking before about how surprised we all were to see Trump be so outwardly, openly transactional with Zelensky and saying, telling him that he didn't have the cards. Do you think that Taiwan has given too many cards too early to the US with the $100 billion investment from TSMC, and how does that impact the Silicon Shield, in your opinion?
Jiki, yeah.
My name is Jikki Verlaren. I'm the Economic Security Coordinator at the Dutch office in Taipei. And I was wondering, we've talked about the near monopoly of TSMC. There's another company in the semiconductor supply chain that has a full monopoly on EUV machines. That's ASML. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on whether ASML, being the monopoly that they are, can end up in the crosshairs of the Trump 2.0 administration. Thank you.
There. All right, the gentleman. Yes.
Right. Hello, I'm Thomas Skroder from KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden and from National Yonsei University. So my question is pretty simple, as in how strong is the semiconductor shield, as in to what extent does it actually protect Taiwan? But I want to qualify that question a little bit. So I'm from a division of history of technology, and one thing you sometimes see is that the very advanced technology, it very often relies on very basic technologies. And the other thing about this is that whenever you take any technology, even very simple technology, it's always a cooperation between many different actors, many different places in the world. There's like a famous TED talk which says something like, nobody in the world knows how to make a computer mouse. So if we're talking those basic things, one thing that seems to be a challenge for TSMC is also that it keeps growing, and can it keep growing in this way? If you're thinking about there might be problems with electricity. Taiwan has some challenges in supplying enough electricity for TSMC. There's also challenges with manpower. There are not many young people any longer. So yeah, and by the way, your book is really awesome, so thank you.
Maybe another question from Dr. Lee.
Thank you. You claim the cloud war of the age of AI in the beginning of January. That's earlier than the DeepSeek released their DeepSeek V3 and DeepSeek R1. So please share with us what is your observation from the chip war to the cloud war. The second question is about when we talk about the component from China, but now in Taiwan government, we already banned the DeepSeek, but we do worry about there are lots of application service use DeepSeek as a foundation model. Not only that, there are some automobile manufacturer already embed DeepSeek as the assistant. So I think that's a really big risk in the very near futures. So what's your comment?
Okay, 3 questions from based on the European perspective, and DeepSeek question from Dr. Lee.
Well, I think in January, when DeepSeek first attracted international attention, it attracted attention for the wrong reason. The standard headline in the second week of January was about how the cost of inference was collapsing. We were surprised by that, or the cost of training was collapsing. We were surprised by that. And when you dig deeper, the inference price decline fit expected curves, and the training price decline was less dramatic than I think DeepSeek advertised, and also fit the expected efficiency improvement. So I think we sort of collectively got DeepSeek wrong in January, and we missed what perhaps is the broader, longer implication, which is that if China dominates the open source space, and companies have a lot of incentive to use open source models if they're good, China can embed its models broadly outside of China. And I do think that there are real risks here. I think there's especially severe risks for if you're calling on the DeepSeek API I think that's obvious. And it's striking to me that that has not been restricted yet in the United States, though I think it will be. It has not yet been restricted. I think in Europe, it's unlikely to be restricted, would be my guess. But I think even reliance on locally running versions of the model, we should think very, very carefully about that, both because of the implications of running DeepSeek and the implications of not running a more trustworthy Western model, because of course market share matters. Market share matters fundamentally. And so, so yes, I think that's the implication of DeepSeek. And I don't think many governments have done enough to think through what they ought to do about that question. When it comes to ASML, I think like TSMC, ASML has something that everyone needs and no one can replicate. And so that's a good position to be in if you have to negotiate. And so I would not be surprised to see countries unhappy about ASML's 100% market share, but I also know that countries need their tools. And so I don't worry that much about companies that have irreplaceable technology and 100% market share. I think they'll do fine, even if they're under pressure. What other questions did we have? The Silicon Shield, yes. The easy question for last. I think well, I mentioned we haven't spent enough time talking about President Xi relative to the amount of time we've spent talking about President Trump. It seems to me that if I were sitting in Beijing, I would look at the current moment with both a lot of concern, but also a sense of opportunism. That as the Western alliance is under intense strain, there's a possibility for China to take advantage. Now, the risk for China is that Trump is difficult to predict, and that when he acts, he takes big moves. And so you would not want to be on the wrong side of that. And so trying to escalate China's activities in the Taiwan Straits, for example, could play out very badly if Trump decided to respond to that in an aggressive fashion. But I think China's also looking at the current moment and thinking there are opportunities as well to split the US and Europe, to drive a wedge between the US and Taiwan, looking at the state of Korean politics. I think there's lots of opportunities for China there to drive a wedge between the US and Japan. I think all this is happening to some degree. The question is, how far will it go? And so I do worry a lot that although we haven't heard much from President Xi over the last 2 months, that doesn't guarantee we won't hear from President Xi over the next couple of years. And I think we should not forget that although President Trump is very good at dominating the headlines, President Xi has agency too. A lot of agency. And so I think that's something for all of us to take seriously. And I think when I have conversations in Washington, it's often forgotten that we're not the only player on the chessboard, and that our moves will have repercussions that we don't always think fully through. And that is something that I worry a lot about, that we don't know what China's next move is.
Final round for another 2 questions, very limited questions. Choose by Jeremy.
Thank you. Excuse me, Will Ripley with CNN. So if you're a betting man and you're looking at China and the United States having any chance of building an advanced chip manufacturing ecosystem that could rival Taiwan, in other words, being able to be right on par with Taiwan in terms of getting these chips out efficiently. It's taken Taiwan decades to build that ecosystem. How many years would it take the US? How many years would it take China? And which country do you think could do it first, if it's possible at all?
Thank you, Professor Miller, for your remarks. My name is Henry Lane from Ministry of Economics. I have a question related to US semiconductor industry. So currently the US government wants to bring manufacturing back to America. However, the salary of software industry is roughly 3 to 4 times higher than semiconductor manufacturing sector in the US. And under this huge pay gap, I was just wondering, how can US attract more young people to pursue manufacturing career? Thank you.
Just similar, right? So how long does our allies pick up and catch up with Taiwan?
Well, on the question of the semiconductor manufacturing workforce in the U.S., I would say two things. I think one, going back to our conversation about creating jobs, I don't think the goal of policy should be to have more manufacturing jobs per se, especially given the wage dynamics that you discussed. However, you need enough of a workforce to achieve whatever manufacturing goals you have. And so that's where I think there's been a focus on building workforce training programs and things like that so you can staff the fabs that are under construction. I think where we've seen interesting change the last couple of years is that there's a lot more excitement now in the US than there was in studying electrical engineering and studying material science. And I hear more and more when I talk to top universities about people double majoring in computer science and double E, for example. You hear that at MIT, you hear that at other top universities, which I think is a response not to the political demands or the workforce training programs, but a response to the fact that the world's most valuable company is a semiconductor company. And so I think there you have economic incentives at work. Jensen has made chips cool again, and therefore you have people in the United States taking the semiconductor industry more seriously as a career path than you would have a couple of years ago. And that's been, I think, a meaningful change over the past couple of years. But that's, again, not primarily focused on manufacturing jobs as traditionally defined. And ultimately, our goal is to automate as much as possible. That's how we become more efficient. And so, again, I would push back against anyone saying our goal should be to have more manufacturing jobs. On the U.S. versus China, I mean, it's impossible to answer in any sort of certainty number of years in U.S. or China. I think you ask who has a broader base of the components that you need to have a complete semiconductor supply chain. The answer right now is, I think, the U.S. A lot of the tool making, for example, happens in the U.S. There is a larger workforce for advanced semiconductor manufacturing in the U.S. than there is in China right now. But if you ask who's willing to sustain expensive policies over the long run to build an economically inefficient and unprofitable chip industry, the answer is China. And so I think that is the key question. For how long will China be willing to spend money building unprofitable companies to compete with Western companies? And I think the track record suggests that China's going to spend a lot of money over the long run and will be satisfied even if the key companies are not globally competitive and not even profitable. And that's the economic policy challenge that I think all of the advanced economies right now are facing in different ways.
Thank you so much, Chris. Because we have already run out of time. We run this space until 9:30, so it's a time for us to wrap up. Please give a warming round of applause for Chris again. Thank you so much for Chris. All right, and thank you so much for participating in the event that we are hosting today. Because although it's a kind of a late night, again, thank you for all of your participation. We're looking forward to seeing you again in the near future. We are going to organizing this event again, maybe monthly. So please keep watch DSET's website or Facebook or our social media. Are we news? Okay, yeah.